people here in the seminar room and some people over Zoom. Thank you. And so if you're in person, feel free to just raise your hand and ask a question, and we'll do our best to remember to repeat it for the Zoom folks. Zoom folks, please keep your audio off unless you have a question, in which case feel free to interject and we will hear you loud and clear. So we're having a lunch with Leah after the seminar. We particularly encourage the women in physics to come. They have been notified, and so should be a nice little party. And with that, let me hand it over to Charles to do the actual introduction.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to all the repeat customers for showing up live. It's really great to have these affairs live again. There are legends that in the before times, there were these godlike figures who would fly in airplanes around the nation or across the ocean to give seminars elsewhere. It sounds incredible. Some of the very old people here will remember it. And at this time of year, it is said that seminars would often have to be canceled because these airplanes were subject to bad weather and couldn't take off or land. And so we reserve, it's not a coincidence. We like to have a JQI seminar each semester given by a junior member of faculty in another part of the university that's doing work related to that of JQI, but who is not an affiliate. And Leah Dodson is just a perfect example of that. She's an assistant professor of chemistry. She came in, is this your beginning of your third year here now? She got a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Case Western University, Case Western Reserve University, and then went and got a PhD in chemistry at Caltech. And she was an NRC postdoc at JILA in Boulder. So she's a sort of an alumnus of NIST. And when I invited her to give a talk, it's usually scheduled at this time because such people aren't hazard to bad weather. That's not the only reason that you were chosen, but it was certainly a factor. When I first introduced myself to her, she referred to the Joint Quantum Institute at JILA East, which is an honorary title of which we're very proud. And so now, without further ado, Leah Dodson.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Charles, for the invitation. I think I actually called JILA JQI West, but maybe your memory is better than mine. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. I've been doing the same thing this semester, inviting local people in the thought, not because of weather, but because of thinking if we get shut down from the pandemic, at least we don't have to cancel flights. So being able to meet locally with people of similar or even dissimilar interests has been an interesting aspect of coming out of lockdown and sharing science across the university and across the state of Maryland. So, so thank you. Actually, I will take my mask off. Thank you for allowing me to come. So today I'm talking about some of the technology that we're building in my lab. And I call it new technology from my perspective as a chemist, but it's actually based on a lot of old technology that the AMO physicists in the audience are going to immediately recognize. So I learned a lot during my time at JILA, looking at the technology that had been developed there to develop ultra cold sources of atoms and molecules, and actually taking a lot of the tools that have been developed in those communities and using them to do chemistry. So it's new technology to the field of chemistry because a lot of this hasn't really become mainstream in our field yet, but a lot of it has been well developed and robustly designed by physicists. So I'll talk about that throughout the talk here today. So my research is in astrochemistry, and sort of the two unifying, the unifying theme not only is astrochemistry, but more importantly, low temperature chemistry. And for me, low temperature chemistry means down to 10 Kelvin. These are the temperatures relevant to the interstellar medium and various planetary bodies that we're interested in studying. So, to set you on the appropriate scale in thinking, we're not talking down to nanokelvin. Those temperatures aren't particularly useful to us in the astrophysical environment in terms of the chemistry that we're studying, but rather temperatures on the scale of 50 to 10 Kelvin is sort of the ballpark we're in. So there's two halves in my lab. One half is looking at, chemistry in the interstellar medium, and those are temperatures down to 50 Kelvin, and this is in particular looking at ion molecule reactions. The other half of my lab is looking at planetary atmospheres. There's a much wider range of temperatures. In particular, this is Europa, which has temperatures from 50 to 100 Kelvin. Of course, we know that Earth is also a planetary atmosphere, so you can be familiar with the temperature ranges there. Venus is a hot topic these days. It is a much hotter planetary atmosphere. So I'm more interested in sort of these low temperature planetary atmospheres. So what really binds all of this together is I find astrochemistry a really fascinating place to study chemistry, because it really challenges us to think about chemistry that is exotic. You know, Earth-based chemistry is room temperature chemistry most often, and we look at we explained you know, in our introductory chemistry classes that things behave sort of in a predictable manner when it comes to chemical reactions, the reactivity. And today I'm going to be talking mostly about canonical rates. So what I actually teach to the pre-meds in the Gen Chem 2 class that I teach in the spring is that we have this dependence of the reaction rate constant on the temperature of the system. And it's inversely, or it's a direct proportional, or it ends up being a positive correlation that as the temperature increases, the rate will increase. And that's because on a first order level, we have the energy of the reactants here. If it's an exothermic process, the products have an energy that is lower. And then we have to get over this transition state barrier to go from reactants to products. And so by increasing the temperature, you increase the amount of thermal energy in the reactants, and then you eventually have enough energy to go over that transition state barrier and onto products. So this is what I teach in my Gen Chem 2 class. This is Arrhenius. As temperature goes up, rate constant goes up. But what I actually think is really, really fascinating is reactions that are non-Arrhenius, reactions that speed up as you go to low temperature. And this is a completely ridiculous idea to chemists, because we're so tied to this idea of Arrhenius. Most of the chemistry that we study in chemistry and even applied to biological systems have this this temperature dependence, especially when you're talking about gas phase chemistry. So one of the unifying themes in my group is non-Arrhenius chemistry, reactions that go faster at low temperature. And that's really important for astrochemistry, because for the longest time, we thought that there would be no molecules in space, because we predicted that there would be no reactions at these low temperatures. You'd never be able to form a molecule because the reaction rates would be negligible at the low temperatures of space. So that's sort of the theme of my research group. I'm going to just talk about the ion molecule chemistry today, because I think that it's going to be using some of the tools that are very familiar to the audience here today. So I'm particularly interested in magnesium chemistry. And this is because there's been some proposals of some connections between magnesium chemistry and the evolution of planetary bodies throughout the stellar evolutionary cycle. So if you consider how we trace molecules as they go through this cycle, we go from star-forming regions to the development of stars, and eventually the star can grow old and die, and eventually form a planetary nebula. And in some cases, it continues around this cycle over and over again. Of course, there's other cycles going on. Yeah.
Should I understand you mean metal chemist sense or the astronomer?
That's a great question. So I mean that in the chemist.
Could you repeat the question?
So the question was, am I thinking about metals in a astronomer sense or a chemist sense? And the answer is the chemist sense. And even that's kind of loose. I think some chemists wouldn't immediately think of magnesium as necessarily a metal, but yes. So magnesium in a metal, metals in a chemist sense. So, so the idea is to trace the chemical evolution, trace the stellar evolution around the cycle by finding tracer molecules that are present in all stages, or tracer atoms that you can kind of use to connect the dots. Because we're not able to actually trace these evolutionary cycles in real time, because they obviously occur over billions of years, but we can actually observe molecules in the individual components of this cycle and connect the dots. It's a really actually fascinating puzzle how astronomers can trace out evolutionary cycles just through observation of molecules. And so one of the proposals is that you might be able to link the observation of magnesium containing species during the red giant phase to the eventual star that might be able to have a planet formed around it. And this is kind of surprising because you'd think it would be a silicon connection, but rather there's this hypothesis that magnesium might be one of those tracer elements that we can use to say, okay, if we're seeing magnesium around this red giant star, it might be connected during a subsequent stage to planet formation. And so I'm interested in looking at magnesium, in particular the magnesium ion chemistry. And this is one of the, yes.
Does magnesium in the atmosphere of a star or nearby, has that been made by that star, or is it a result of something that happened?
Right. So the question was about how the magnesium is formed. Magnesium would need to be formed during a supernova. And so it wouldn't be, you know, a normal sort of star cycle. It would have to be off onto a supernova branch, but the material gets recycled through the eons. You contain the same material in that general location. So yeah, it would have been from that.
But it's not subject to radioactive transformation within the star.
Right.
Nuclear
reaction.
Right.
Following up on that, this is Bill Phillips. A lot of the things that we used to think, or at least I used to think, were formed in supernova explosions are now said to be formed in binary black hole collapses or neutron star collapses. Would that be true of something like magnesium?
That's right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm not aware that magnesium has been implicated under that scenario. I think that it's still, but I'm not aware of that, but I might not be fully aware of the current status of the nuclear syntheses. Okay, so the chemistry of magnesium that I'm interested in studying in particular is this reaction shown here. This is a radiative association reaction where you take a magnesium cation and you react it with a neutral molecule, which I'll discuss later. The details aren't really that important right now. But the point is we end up forming a magnesium containing molecule that also has a cyanide, a CN group. And these kinds of molecules are being observed in the circumstellar envelopes of evolved stars. And so the idea is that if we can properly constrain the amount of these magnesium cyanide species around these stars, then we can properly account for the total magnesium budget of that particular star. So tracking the magnesium, it needs to involve the full understanding of all of the molecules that might actually contain a magnesium, elemental magnesium. All right, so the radiative association, yeah.
That H nu, is that a photon or a neutrino?
That was a photon.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. And I'll talk more. So I'll talk more particularly about that photon. Actually, that is H nu is a photon. So the radiative association reaction, as the question just alluded to, is kind of a difficult reaction to think about in terms of chemistry. Usually when we think about a collision reaction in chemistry, we're thinking about this in terms of a high pressure environment. And so you might imagine that an ion dipole reaction is going to lead to a collision complex. That collision complex is going to be stabilized by a collision with a third body, and then the excess energy in that collision complex is going to be taken away by the third body. And in this case, and when thinking about circumstellar chemistry, the densities are so low that you don't have that third body around to take away the energy. And so in order for this ion dipole reaction to result in a stable product, you need to remove the energy some way. And the way you do that is through emission of a photon. And so this shows that this magnesium ion is going to react with one of the reaction partners. This is cyanocetylene. I mentioned that there's a carbon-nitrogen triple bond. So these are important for biological, astrobiological studies. We're interested in anything that involves a carbon-nitrogen bond. It's also this really interesting linear molecule that most Earth-based chemists are baffled by, because these are totally exotic molecules that are not typically thought of in our terrestrial chemistry. And also I will kind of mention, this probably is magnesium monocation is probably not surprising to this audience because of using magnesium monocation in ion trapping experiments. However, I often, when I give chemistry talks, get questioned about my magnesium monocation, because in chemistry and biology, we're always talking about the dication, and everyone always thinks I have the wrong charge state on my magnesium ion. But of course, this is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the magnesium monocation because that's actually what is relevant in space chemistry as well.
It's a four-man sodium when you think about it.
Sure.
In fact, photo association is like one of the sodium photo associations, one of the big hits of ultra cold AMO physics.
Yeah.
I guess radiative association is important here because there's nothing else. There's no third.
You got it. You got it. Yeah, that's the thing with astrochemistry is you do this exotic chemistry because it's the only chemistry possible. You don't have the third body. You don't have thermal energy that allows you to undergo reactions that are, require some sort of activation barrier to be overcome. And so this is why astrochemistry is, interested in radiative association, because it's one of the few reactions that can actually happen. It ends up driving a lot of the chemistry in the very cold, sort of very diffuse regions of space. Okay, so we have this collision.
This is Bill Phillips again.
Mm-hmm.
So following up on this idea about the lack of a third body, one of the things that one thinks about with a sufficiently complex molecule involved in a collision, and for an atomic physicist, it doesn't have to be very complex before it's really complex. We ascribe to the idea that Art Shallow said that a diatomic molecule is one that has one too many atoms. Yeah. But what I'm getting at is that in say associating, you have to have that third body. But on the other hand, internal degrees of freedom of a sufficiently complex molecule could stabilize a collision complex for a long time before it finally spits back the reactant that came in, or maybe have a long enough time that a photon goes out. Is that something that's important in these reactions, that there are lots of degrees of freedom, vibrational, rotational, and bending, and all that kind of stuff?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. That is something that matters. You'll notice we are dealing with linear molecules in this case. As we get to what we'll actually find, I'll talk about it in a second, is that as you get to longer and longer molecules, then actually the rate constant does increase. And I think that that's because the lifetime of your collision complex, ends up being longer, because of exactly what you stated, the sort of the IBR processes. But yeah, we don't have a ton of degrees of freedom in this particular case, because we're trying to go with simpler molecules that, that are both relevant to astrochemistry and also are something that could be feasible someday for a theorist to do sort of the full quantum dynamics treatment on them.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right, so the magnesium monocation combines with this cyanocetylene molecule. And I'm drawing this showing that the magnesium is binding directly to the nitrogen atom. I'll get into that in more detail later. And you have this excited molecule, this excited complex that has more energy than the bound equilibrium structure would need. And so then you get this emission of a photon to relax your molecule down to the energetic ground state. And so this formation of this magnesium cyanide species is going to compete with other processes in the circumstellar region of these evolved stars for the sort of budget of elemental magnesium. So if you think about one of the competing processes would just be electron recombination with a magnesium ion to form a neutral atomic magnesium. These are particularly difficult to detect in space. And so we would perhaps not be able to fully budget for all of the magnesium if this is sort of the main cycle that's occurring. But if we also have this competitive reaction where you form this detectable magnesium cyanide species, which will eventually, I'll show you how that eventually becomes a neutral molecule in space. If we're not actually detecting these organomagnesium species in space, then we've lost sort of part of the budget of magnesium, elemental magnesium in space. Okay, so this is the molecule that I said is expected to form. It makes sense to me as a chemist that the electron-rich nitrogen side of this molecule would bind to the electron poor magnesium ion. So that makes sense to me. This is what you get when you run the computational chemistry calculations. And it's a pretty weakly bound molecule. Most of the charge remains on the magnesium ion, and it's a pretty decently long magnesium nitrogen bond distance. So I said it's a weakly bound molecule. It's about 153 kilojoules per mole binding energy. But what I, as a chemist, am particularly interested in is the fact that once this ion recombines with an electron, the theoretical fate of this ion is that it's going to release a hydrogen atom, and you'll get this, if you keep all of your bonding in order, you have the C3NMG molecule that's formed, which to me, I mean, that's pretty exotic for exotic chemistry from my perspective. But okay, so this, let's say, okay, there's no rearrangement that's happening in terms of the bonding, and let's just pretend that that's the molecule that eventually gets formed in space. Now then we can look at actually what's been detected in space, and based on the rotational spectroscopy, astronomers have identified the formation of, whoops, I keep doing that. Has identified the formation of these magnesium C3N molecules. And they know based on the rotational spectrum that the magnesium is bonded directly to the carbon atom. Right? I told you before that the magnesium was going to bind directly to the nitrogen atom. So what they've seen when they've looked for these organomagnesium species in space, it can be uniquely identified as this molecule. And they point to these radiative association reactions as the way that these molecules are being formed. However, there would have to be some sort of an isomerization process to bring this magnesium atom from one end of this molecule to the other, and then kick off this hydrogen atom. So this is sort of a challenge for me as an experimentalist to kind of rectify what is being seen in these computational estimates compared with the observed molecules that are in space, and whether these astronomers are correct in saying that these radiative association reactions are exactly what's leading to these organomagnesium compounds.
If you substitute magnesium by beryllium, does that give a molecule similar structure?
Beryllium. Oh, you don't have a periodic table in here.
That's a pretty advanced subject. Isoelectronic.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. I don't know. I haven't done any of the computational chemistry below that, just because the computations that I'm using aren't equipped to do something like beryllium.
I was just wondering if you have been seen.
I don't believe beryllium has been seen in space.
Kind of a common element.
Yeah.
Albeit a metal.
Yeah. Sure. All right. Okay. So this is the chemical reaction that I want to study, and we have these questions sort of about the product that's forming. But really, we want to be able to study this reaction under conditions that are similar to those that are found in space. And the reason for that is because these reactions are expected to be temperature dependent, and so we can't just use room temperature measurements. There've been quite a few room temperature measurements of similar reactions to this, including magnesium plus cyanacetylene. They've been done at room temperature, but it's really challenging to sort of apply the room temperature measurements to the low temperature 10 Kelvin conditions that are experienced in space. So my goal is going to be for my group to come up with ways of doing these reactions at the temperatures relevant to space. And this means we're going to need temperature controlled sources of both of our reactants. But the question is, where does this temperature dependence come from? Because I told you this is an ion dipole reaction. And so, in our general physics and chemistry classes, we know how to calculate the rate constant of an ion dipole reaction. It's just Langevin theory. And there's no temperature dependence to this rate constant for the reaction of an ion and in this case, it's an ion nonpolar molecule. And then when you think about an ion dipole, you do have this temperature dependence that can come into it that kind of comes from an empirical treatment of the system. And basically, you can back out a temperature dependence based on these empirically developed theories. And then, of course, you also have sort of competing with this, we're going to be dealing with, we're not actually going to be able to do our reactions at temperature, at the conditions of space in terms of the pressure. So we do need to think about the temperature dependence of the competing three-body association reactions that are going to be competing in our reaction system. And I do want to actually mention, this has nothing to do with ion dipole reactions, but I kind of want to motivate sort of why I think this sort of chemistry is really, really cool. This is an example of a chemical reaction of OH plus acetone, and it has this crazy U-shaped temperature dependence, which actually has to do with hydrogen atom tunneling. And I think this is sort of exhibits some of the amazing science that we can end up doing when we start thinking about going to these very low temperatures and trying to understand the mechanism that leads to these, what I would think is a really exotic temperature dependence. So this is the sort of exciting chemistry that I'm interested in studying. And what we're finding is that if you use some of the traditional statistical based theories to actually predict the temperature dependence of the rate constant for ion molecule reactions like the one I've shown you, they can often be sometimes be up to 4 orders of magnitude different from the experimental rate constant. So these statistical theories have long been used to predict the temperature dependence of these reactions, but sometimes they fall flat. And this is something that has been done, especially with these radiative association reactions, is actually linking the sort of parameters that we can find for these radiative association reactions to the temperature dependence of them. And so I'm going to talk to you sort of generally about a radiative association reaction, just in general of reactant A plus B, and they don't need to be charged species. This is the case. You can also have radiative association of neutrals. Of course, we all know that ions are a lot easier to work with. So often we will have one of the reactants be an ion. And so then we'll form a collision complex AB, which then emits a photon H nu. And what the quantum dynamics treatments are finding is that these reaction rates depend on the total angular momentum J of the system of the reactions, and then also the dipole moments of the complex that's formed. So this is an example of some work that was done recently on the reaction between aluminum cation and H2, which forms this collision complex where you have this sort of T-shaped structure. And what they found using a full quantum dynamics treatment is you can actually find that there's a heavy J dependence, where J describes the rotational state of the H2 co-reactant. And so if you actually look at this plot, you can see that for J equals 0 or J equals 1, you get these, or J equals 2, you get these pretty fast rate constants as you go down in temperature. They're pretty flat, increasing slightly, but overall they're quite fast. But then as soon as you get to J equals 3 or 4, the rate constant drops dramatically down by sort of almost 2 orders of magnitude, and J = 5 is just way down here and super slow. And so this sort of shows that the temperature dependence of this reaction is controlled by the rotational state of the reactants. And so we really have to think carefully about these statistical treatments. This is one of the examples where they got like a 4 order of magnitude difference between the quantum dynamics treatment and the statistical rate theory. So in this example, the reactions I'm studying are magnesium monocation with these cyano species. And so in order to study the total angular momentum dependence, as well as the dependence on the dipole moment of the complex, we're going to be looking at preparing our molecules in a way in the rotational, in certain rotational states, and then also looking at changing the dipole moment of the complex by actually changing the chain length. And so to start out with, I'm going to start with the smallest cyanide species I know of, that's hydrogen cyanide. And so we actually found that in order to study this molecule under different buffer gas conditions, different concentrations, things like that, we needed to actually be able to make this molecule ourselves and prepare mixtures of this hydrogen cyanide, in particular concentrations in buffer gases. So we found that the easiest way to do this was actually, because we are chemists, we actually synthesized it ourselves. And so that was very weird for me because I'm not a synthetic chemist at all. And so the first thing my group ever did was synthesize hydrogen cyanide. But it worked. So this is the hydrogen cyanide. These are the vibrations of the molecule. This CN stretch is going to end up being not an allowed transition, but the CH stretch is a nice vibrational feature that we're looking at. And so we took that hydrogen cyanide that we synthesized. I was curious how well we did, since I'm not a synthetic chemist, and we put it in an FTIR. And this is just the gas phase spectrum of the hydrogen cyanide, which matched perfectly with the known hydrogen cyanide spectrum. We didn't see any signs of impurities. The CO2 that's here, that's just atmospheric CO2 because we hadn't purged our FTIR properly. And we can actually zoom in and see that we've got actually our FTIR has really nice resolution. We've got the rotationally resolved structure of this is the CH stretch fundamental here. And so we have a nice, it's pretty pressure broadened spectrum in this case. And so I'll mention, since I'm talking about rotational energy, at room temperature, the maximum J value for hydrogen cyanide is going to be J = 8. So I showed you those plots before where you saw the J dependence of the rate constant, and you saw that at high J, the rate constant was really, really slow. And so we would expect that this rate constant, if the hydrogen cyanide plus magnesium reaction follows the same sort of trend, you'd expect that to be a really, really slow reaction at room temperature. And so our goal is to prepare our hydrogen cyanide at lower temperatures so we can access more of those low J states. I'll qualify right now, we are not doing state selective rotational reactions. That's a long-term goal of my group, but for now we're going to be using Boltzmann averaged temperature dependent studies where we vary the temperature of the system and then actually extract out the J dependence from running the reaction at multiple temperatures. So this is one of the tools I alluded to that you're probably very familiar with. This is a buffer gas cell. It was originally conceptualized and worked with by Frank DeLuca, and it's used a lot as sort of the first step in atom cooling often. And so we are using it as a general source of cold neutral molecules in our case. We really like that this tool, you don't need to have a sort of a gas cylinder filled of your molecule of interest. There's a lot of different ways of using the buffer gas cell to produce cold neutral molecules in the gas phase. And it's capable of getting down to temperatures down to 4 Kelvin. So this is right in the temperature range that we need for astrochemistry experiments. So just to sort of show the perspective as a chemist of what I'm interested in for using this tool, I'm very interested in how this is able to prepare rotationally cold molecules. And I'm also very interested in that the forward the beam forward velocity is much slower than you get for supersonic tools, but of course its intensity is much brighter than an effusive beam. So of course we have a few ways of getting neutral molecules into this buffer gas cell and cooling them. Right now what we're using is an inlet that allows us to flow the hydrogen cyanide into the buffer gas cell. And then we have a variety of buffer gases that we also flow into the buffer gas cell. This species the hydrogen cyanide can either be a mixture or pure, it just depends on how we prepared it. And then through the buffer gas colliding with the cold walls, that reaches thermal equilibrium with the cell. Yeah.
What do you use to cool the buffer gas? Is it helium or pulse tube?
We have a helium cryostat. Yeah. Closed cycle helium cryostat. Yeah. One of the GM types, not a pulse tube. Yeah. So we cool the buffer gas cell down continuously to the temperature of interest. We have a variety of buffer gases that we use. Right now we're using argon for technical reasons, but of course we can also plan to use helium. And through collisions of the buffer gas with the hydrogen cyanide, we're able to rotationally, translationally cool the molecule down. So this is our buffer gas attached to that aforementioned helium cryostat. We have inlets that flow through copper tubes, which can be pre-cooled. And then at the center part here is our buffer gas cell. We have these radiation shields around our buffer gas cell, both the first stage and second stage heat shields. And I think actually, so the buffer gas cell is actually made in the physics machine shop. And we're anxiously awaiting the return of the machinists there. Okay, so this is our cell, and basically the idea is we've got the hydrogen cyanide flowing out of the cell, and right now we're using 1% mixture. I mentioned that we really want to be able to prepare a tunable concentration, so that's why we make our own hydrogen cyanide. In this case, we're using argon right now, and this is showing a simulation of how the buffer gas is going to be skimmed and then produce a nice collimated beam out that can extend a quite long distance, which we'll eventually need to get into our reaction chamber. So we typically have about 10 to the 16 buffer gas atoms per centimeter cubed, and with our 1% hydrogen cyanide mix, we have about 10 to 14 hydrogen cyanide. And of course, those densities drop quite significantly when we get to the sort of reaction region. But this is why we're doing ion molecule reactions, because the ion detection is going to be very efficient. So we're able to detect a very small number of products. So some of the things I worry about with these experiments is for example, the temperature. So these buffer gas cells, like I said, have often been used as that first step in producing cold atoms and molecules for the experiments that you all do. And generally, we assume that the molecules coming, or the atoms coming out of the buffer gas cell are in thermodynamic equilibrium. But there's not been a lot of evidence pointing to the actual rotational cooling of molecules in this buffer gas cell. We generally assume that it's cold, but I'd like to see for myself, especially since I mentioned that we're going to be doing these Boltzmann averaged experiments where we rely on a good knowledge of the rotational temperature of our reactant in order to actually back out those state-dependent rate constants or cross sections. So that's something I worry about a lot. The other thing we've actually discovered is that we have to worry about whether we really truly have pure hydrogen cyanide. And the problem with that is that hydrogen cyanide likes to dimerize and trimerize and form higher order polymers. And we've seen evidence for this by depositing the buffer gas cell output onto a cold matrix, a cold substrate that we can then do FTIR on, so we can actually see what was in the components of the buffer gas cell, buffer gas beam. I mean, that's why we're using argon, because we can actually freeze argon at 15 Kelvin. And so when we vary the temperature of that buffer gas cell and start cooling it down, we actually are seeing that there is dimer present in our reaction in our buffer gas cell. And so this is something I need to think about as a chemist as we're doing chemical reactions of hydrogen cyanide with these ions. We need to worry about whether we actually have dimers present that are also reacting at the same time. So that's something that we're working on right now, and are using some of the other tools in our lab to characterize the buffer gas beam. But moving forward, we'd like to really be able to fully quantify the buffer gas cooling that's happening in our buffer gas cell. And we want to be able to know that we have confidence in our J dependence of our reaction rate. And so we want to prepare the reactants at different temperatures and see the effect of the temperature change on the rate constant. And so we'll be doing spectroscopy to characterize the rotational temperature of our hydrogen cyanide. So we have an example here of a simulation from Hytran at 2 different example temperatures that we'll be working at, 10 Kelvin and 50 Kelvin. And you can see that you really get that higher population of those low J states when you start cooling down to these temperature ranges. And so although we're not doing state selective chemistry, we can actually really start to get up to 40% in this case. At 10 Kelvin, you got up to like 40% in J equals 1 there. And so we have looked at sort of this, I showed this spectrum to you before, this rotationally resolved infrared spectrum. And what we're actually interested in doing is looking at this particular band. This is the CH stretch overtone region, and looking at the temperature of the molecule, the rotational temperature of the molecule, doing spectroscopy in this region. Of course, this is a nice region to target because diodes are readily available in this region. So that's what we're doing. We're going to be doing cavity ring down spectroscopy on the hydrogen cyanide that we've buffer gas cooled. We have a diode laser that's centered right in that CH overtone stretch region. And we'll be doing cavity ring down spectroscopy. The long-term goal is to actually put the buffer gas cell inside of our optical cavity and actually do the ring down measurements on the molecules in that region. This is work that was inspired by some of the work that I saw in the Yi group at JILA. So these are the instrumentation that we have for this standard ring down, although of course it's quite difficult to put a ring down cavity around a vibrating system. So we're very thinking about the technical challenges of that. So this is the predicted ring down spectrum of hydrogen cyanide. These are the simulation conditions. So this is going to be, if we assume that we've got the hydrogen cyanide confined to our buffer gas cell, which is about a 3 centimeter long optical path length, we're able to detect 10 to the 14 hydrogen cyanide molecules per centimeter cubed, which is the perfect range for our buffer gas cooling. These are Doppler broadened lines then. And the laser that we purchased is going to have some really great, it's got this pretty broad mode hop free scanning range. And so at minimum, we're going to be able to cover three rotational lines simultaneously. So that's in progress. We're just waiting on the mirrors to get here, and we're moving forward with the setup of that ring down system to actually measure that rotational temperature. All right. So that's the temperature controlled source hydrogens of, well, I talked about hydrogen cyanide. Those we plan to extend those to the larger cyanopolyynes. And so we need now this temperature controlled source of magnesium. In our case, we're working with a custom designed mass spectrometer that's going to eventually be able to create and cool our magnesium ions and then be incorporated in with that buffer gas system. So it's very modular. We designed it to be able to be nimble in responding sort of to the needs of the Astrochem community. As for example, if beryllium becomes the hot element, we'll certainly be able to change our ion source. So our ion source, we're using a glow discharge. This is a way of producing metal ions in the gas phase, notably very good at producing metal monocations. And this works by several different processes. Essentially, you're sputtering argon atoms onto a piece of metal that then allows you to eject the neutral, in this case, magnesium atoms. And then those magnesium atoms enter the glow, the plasma, that's formed, and through a few processes, you form magnesium monocations that then we can extract into our mass spectrometer. We have a rectilinear ion guide that allows us to get from those high pressure regions where the glow discharge is occurring. This is a sort of a non-standard rectilinear ion guide that has these asymptotic field shaping rods that kind of allows us to push the ions through the high pressure regions of our instrument and then out into the lower pressure regions. With very good extraction efficiency and pretty broad sort of transfer. We then separate the ions from any residual neutrals and have the ions pass through a mass selective quadrupole mass filter that can pass ions up to about 200 AMU. Finally, we will guide those ions into a rectilinear ion trap. Right now, we have a room temperature ion trap. The plan moving forward is to attach a helium cryostat to our ion trap. Of course, that's easier said than done, but we'll be adding that so that we can actually cool our magnesium ions through collisions with a buffer gas. So the way we're going to do kinetics with this instrument is we're going to be injecting the ions using a pulsed signal from the quadrupole bender that allows us to inject the ions with a time-0 pulse. And then we have our neutral molecules floating around in the vicinity of this ion trap. So it's going to have shielding around it that allows us to kind of get to a higher pressure in that region. And then the ions collide with the neutral molecules, react, and then we can extract the product ions through changing the voltages, flipping everything around, and we can detect the products either on the detector that sits down here, or we can actually send it back up into the mass spectrometer where that mass filter is for mass-dependent product detection. So at this point, our ion instrument is creating ions. Right now, I'm showing you the glow discharge ion signal from, we actually just took, we took a piece of Swagelok, actually, a brass piece of Swagelok, and put it in our instrument because it turns out that copper and zinc form a nice stable plasma. So we were actually able to get a really good ion signal from them. And we could see that we do indeed form copper and zinc ions, as well as the isotopes. All of our work is done at the natural isotope abundance. And we also see a lot of other ions here that really motivate us to use that mass filter to isolate just the magnesium monocation that we're interested in. And then moving forward, we will be adding this cryogenic cooling technology onto our ion trap. Very interested in hearing about opinions on cryogenic cooling of ion traps, especially those that need to be used at somewhat higher pressure regions where collisions become relevant. And then we'll be injecting the cold hydrogen cyanide beam into that ion trap, and that's where we're going to actually be carrying out those temperature-dependent reactions. So I'll just close by saying that's sort of one half of my lab. We've been working on these circumstellar ion chemistry. I have another half of my lab that's using other cryogenic tools to look at low temperature chemistry and looking at sort of some of those more exotic reaction mechanisms that can happen when you get to low temperature. With that, I'll just finish by saying I'm very excited. You all know probably that we've torn down a building in the chemistry department, and we're building up a new wing that should be, we'll be moving in 2023 or 4, I guess. So I will be moving into that new wing. The basement is sort of set aside as the quantum chemistry realm. And they're putting a lot of thought into designing a low noise, stable sort of basement for precision type measurements. So I'm very excited to be moving into that building very soon. So this is my group. Right now I have 3 chemistry PhD students. I had a chemical physics rotation student with me this fall. and an undergrad in chemistry, and then there's 2 other undergrads in chemical physics in chemical engineering. So it's been, I give a lot of credit to these students for setting up a new lab during the pandemic. They have been resilient, and I appreciate that. All my funding has come from the chemistry department and the graduate school here, and as well as the computational resources. So with that, thank you very much.
Well, who'd like to start? Yes.
Yeah.
What's the general mechanism that generates the ionized magnesium in the interstellar?
Would you repeat the question?
Yes. So the question was, how is magnesium ion generated in space? So it's going to be, all of various ionizing radiation interacting with elemental atomic magnesium is likely your main source for that. Yeah. Yes.
Do you expect similar rate with HCN as for the aluminum plus?
Yeah.
H2?
Yeah, so the question is about comparing the rate of Mg plus with HCN to the rate of aluminum plus with H2. And the question is that it's going to be a very different rate, and there's a lot of experimental reasons for why that is the case. So that aluminum plus H2 is an incredibly slow reaction from the perspective of even from a radiative association sort of viewpoint. So those reactions would be extremely challenging to study experimentally. I think the half-life of that is about the half-life of a PhD. So I think I probably don't want to study that particular reaction. So the HCN plus Mg plus is going to be much faster. Even that might be too slow for us to study on a reasonable time scale. If you believe the statistical kinetics theory that they say that that's going to be pretty slow. And the room temperature experiments definitely observed that it was very slow. So I don't know if that's going to be our most successful reaction. And that's why we're pushing to those larger cyanopolyynes, because those are going to have faster rates.
Something from online?
Yes, this is Bill Phillips. You've described, and I think Charles in his introduction described the reactions you're talking about as radiative association. Now, there's another kind of radiative association that cold atom people like to do, which is that you put in a photon to 2 colliding atoms, and they form a molecule that often decays and dissociates after radiative decay. Now, what I'm wondering is, do you see that there's a very big difference between which side of the equation the photon is on, whether it goes into to create the reaction or whether it comes out to allow the reaction?
Yeah, so I think that we generally think about radiative association as sort of the inverse of photodissociation. That would probably be, because what you've described is a much more challenging process where you have 2 bodies interacting then with the photon. I think that the true inverse of the radiative association would be 1 body that gets hit by a photon and then breaks into 2. I don't think I answered your question, though.
What I'm wondering is the physics a whole lot different?
I would say it is, yeah. I think since it's not, I think that the photodissociation would be the more similar comparison.
Okay.
Yeah, there's another process that's it's particularly important, I think, in plasma stellar atmospheres. Dielectronic recombination, where you get a transient capture of an electron into say, a multiply excited state, which then radiates and decays into a bound state. I guess that mechanism isn't so.
So is that an ion with an electron, or?
A typical example would be in magnesium. Electron impact on magnesium magnesium plus would give a, let's say, a doubly excited state, 3p squared, which could then radiate down 3p.
Yeah, I guess one thing that
It forms a transient bound
Sure.
complex
yeah.
with a strong electric dipole.
Yeah, I think one thing that I skipped over sort of mentioning is what we in this particular mechanism for these types of radiative association, what's usually emitted is an infrared photon. And so we're not dealing with different electronic states, we're dealing with different vibrational states usually, is what we're considering. So I think, you know, what Dr. Phillips was talking about, maybe, I guess, is that like a Rydberg sort of, would that be a Rydberg state that then is formed and then the, yeah, so I think that it's probably dealing with different types of energy in that case.
Well, typically it would be an electronically excited state, but not a Rydberg state. That is,
Okay.
at least the first things that were studied were just exciting to the first P state in sodium. So one way of thinking of it was that you created an excitation of an alkali dimer where the excitation is shared between the two
Right.
the two atoms, and in a certain sense
Right.
the photon becomes the glue that holds the molecule together.
Interesting. Yeah, I think there certainly are radiative association reactions that proceed on electronic excited states, but those are generally much faster, and where in this case the mechanisms are involving probably infrared photons, which I'd love to actually detect. I'd love to actually detect the infrared photon coming off this radiative association reaction, but that's a tough experiment.
Indeed, some of the work that Bill has alluded to was done both at NIST and at the University of Maryland, experimentally with John Weiner's group. Oh, geez, in the late 80s, early 90s.
Okay.
Very, very influential development. Also made atomic physics.
Yeah, that was certainly 20th century physics.
Well, this is the sort of stuff that I'm really excited to learn about here at JQI. Is all these, like I said, what I learned from Jilla was just so much information. I'm hoping to continue to do the same here.
Would like to have the last word? Hearing none, let's thank Leah again for a great talk.